Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online series At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Kymberly Pinder, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Dean of the Yale School of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome Sue Williamson to our program today. But first, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Before we begin, I would like to say, note that this program will be recorded and is being recorded right now. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Sue, and they will be answered at the end of the program. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the program, but just be aware that we will be answering them as many as we can with some time allotted for the end. I also would like to do a land acknowledgement now. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticock, Golden Hill, Pocosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Now I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Sue Williamson. There's a lot to say, and I encourage you to look up more about her as we progress through this wonderful interview. Born in Lichfield, England in 1941, Williamson immigrated with her family to South Africa when she was 7 years old. She is a member of the generation of South African artists whose work challenged the apartheid government in the 1970s and 1980s. Her work engages with themes of memory, trauma, and identity formation. Trained as a printmaker, Williamson works across media, including photography, video, mixed media installation, and constructed objects. In 2007, Williamson received a Visual Artist Research Award from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and in 2011, she received a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Creative Arts Fellowship. Williamson's work is held in many public collections, and she has participated in numerous international group exhibitions. She is also known for her writings about art. She lives and works in Cape Town, South Africa, where she is with us today. Hello, Sue. Great to see you. I am so glad to have this time with you today. I think we already have some questions that Sue and I have been talking about over a number of meetings. And so I'd like to get directly into those so we can see some of her work. One of the last things I mentioned in your bio are the writings. So like many artists who have seen a deficit in the history of art, you filled that in one of your most seminal texts, Resistance Art in South Africa from 1989. That is how I personally, as an art historian, first connected with you and your work as an artist, because it was, again, first published in 1990, but one of the first books that gave access to the type of artwork and activist work that was being done in South Africa during apartheid. So when I was teaching the history of mural painting in the mid-90s, I had to have your book. And because of your book, so many of my students were actually able to have access and to know about the work that was being done there. Could you speak a bit about what drove you to take the time to document the work of your peers at that really pivotal and critical time during the movement?
Well, at that time, I was not only making art, but I was also involved in a number of human rights groups and activist groups. And I saw this kind of documentation as an act of activism, actually, because there was so much going on. In fact, I had been invited to a conference in New York in 1987, the Women's Caucus for Art, and it was on the subject of liberation, and I was invited to make a presentation in which I showed some of this work, and people were so interested that I went home and spoke to my publisher and said, well, I've had this idea, and he said, great, let's do it. So I began traveling around South Africa, talking to artists, taking photographs of murals and graffiti and the art of the streets, because that was a very important part of the work that we were doing as artists at that time. But I also talked to artists like Alfred Tober, who was working in a tiny little garage in Hillbrow, a part of Johannesburg, making his paintings. This one on the left that you see was about the 1976 riots and uprisings in Soweto, when the children refused to be taught in Afrikaans anymore. On the right, you see work by David Hlongwane, lino cuts. Lino cuts were a very popular form of art making because it was easy to cut lino and you could print on your kitchen table. And then there were also the other artists like Paul Stopforth, one of the university lecturers at the University of Witwatersrand, and these are his portraits of the policemen who were responsible for the death of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko. I also included my own work in this, and I had been working on a series of portraits of women who were prominent in the struggle against apartheid. And what I was doing at that stage was I was meeting the women. This is Helen Joseph, a very important figure in the struggle. I would photograph people and then I would put something of their story in the background. So I've in the window behind Helen, well, you can't really see in this image, but she's standing on the balcony on the stoop of her house in Johannesburg, where she was under house arrest for many years. And in the background, it's the gathering of the Congress of the People, where the Freedom Charter was drafted for the first time, which governs our constitution to this day. This is Annie Selinga. Annie, I knew because she was a member of some of the women's organizations I was a member of too. And she was famous because she refused to carry a pass, even though she was entitled to. And not everybody could get a pass. And I'm going to be talking a little more about passes later. But again, I photographed her in Langa, again, on the veranda of her house. And in the background, I then put in the story of how she'd addressed a public meeting and announced publicly she'd carry a pass when the Prime Minister's wife did. And for that, she was sent back to the Transkei, which was one of the rural areas. So that each of these portraits told something more about the person. And a couple of years later, Annie died. And then I was asked by the Selinga family, please, to make the T-shirts for the funeral and print them. T-shirts, or these kinds of memorial objects were very important in funerals.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject there because one of the things that really made an impact on me in that book actually was the whole section that you had on T-shirts, as you mentioned, because they were so important. And I was able to return to that topic with some of my own work and dealing with how T-shirts still are, not just in South Africa, but the ripped, rest in peace type of T-shirts that became so popular, for instance, in the United States, with funerals based on gang violence and other types of racialized violence. So I just wanted to point that out, was that this was, again, one of the first art historical texts that took on artistic expression in the T-shirt as something that was incredibly significant to that type of public and community engaged art that you were focusing on. And I wanted to also ask you, when you're talking about Selinga, we are currently in an art historical moment that is brimming with artists trained and self-taught who are using artistic expression as these artists that you focused on and as yourself to address many serious issues of oppression and inequity that resonate with what you were representing a few decades ago and currently still represent. What do you say, with your experience, to these artists today who are involved in this type of work, given what you have learned as an activist artist who saw so many people, both activists and artist activists, who risked their lives, and some of them lost their lives for a cause. And a follow-up with that is, what has been the challenges for you as a white woman standing for people of color, representing them? I know there are many white artists and artists of color who ask themselves, how can I represent someone else? How can I represent a person of color and be an authentic ally when that isn't my experience? But I am so committed to making sure that I want to represent it.
Yes, I think that this is a very important question indeed. In fact, it's a key question. And the issue of who speaks for who is allowed to speak for who, is one that has always been central in South Africa. As you say, how do you, one can never fully experience the difficulties and trauma of being a person of a different color or a different gender. You can't be in somebody else's skin, but how can you empower them, and how can you work to present their voice in a way that is authentic and genuine?
Can you show some more of these images after this too?
Sure, sorry.
That's all. I just want to make sure that we can see them all.
Yes, so this one is Virginia Ngoma, who was instrumental in organizing a very important bus boycott against a large bus company in Johannesburg. And the way that I work generally is to do an awful lot of listening. I ask people, there's a lot of interviewing, listening very carefully to what people are saying, and then asking, what is it that you feel about your life? What would you like people to know? And trying to work with that rather than me deciding what it should be. I try to, and then having decided on something like, for instance, what is one of the most important things in your life? What would you like to be remembered for? So that's the way that I work. And then telling people that if they don't like anything that I'm working with at any point, they are at liberty to refuse or say that that's not what they feel. They don't want to be represented that way. That's their option. But I think a very key word for me is always respect. Listen first and respect. But at the same time, one can't allow oneself to, when injustice is going on around you or there's a big issue, you can't allow yourself either to be helpless in the situation. I think you need to act. This is a series of the portraits of women. This is in the Zeitz Museum with posters of Miriam Makeba wallpapering the wall behind the portraits. And then this is a pass book. And I mentioned passes earlier. This is one of the objects that I've worked with. This little book is about the size of a passport. It's a book that every Black South African had to carry with them at all times. And it was a system of control. And this piece is one that I made. It just came down from the Museum of Modern Art. Some New Yorkers might have seen it there. It's called For 30 Years Next to His Heart, and it's called that because Mr. Ngesi carried this passbook from the 50s right up until I borrowed it from him in 1990. And in the top, when I looked at it, I was designing a book cover which had many stories about passbook problems in it, and I asked if I could borrow it from him. And then when I looked at it and saw exactly how full of signatures it is and stamps and incidents, I realized that it was a history of his entire life. So in the top left-hand picture, you see his hand putting his passbook out of his pocket. And then it goes through with all the stamps and where he could live. It prescribed everything, where he could live at any one time, who he was working for, and whether that employer had signed his passbook that month, whether he'd paid his taxes. And yes, it was probably the most hated thing. It was called the dom pass, which means dom, stupid, dumb pass. People hated it. And then again, this is another series that I did, demolitions, the division of South Africa up into areas of white, black, colored, Asian, other went on. And this is an area of Cape Town called District 6. This is a photograph that was taken in 1981. I was one of the Friends of District 6 trying to work to stop the demolitions. The government had announced in the 1960s that District 6 was to be a white area, and they slowly began demolishing houses and moving people out. And you can still see quite a lot of the houses in the background. Some areas were still remaining then, but it was going down fast. And so I've got with some assistance in gathering objects from a demolition site. And one of my friends in District 6 and head of the District 6 Residents Association was Naz O'Brien. She wrote in the entrance to her house, "Welcome to the Last Supper." The Last Supper. And so this is the installation, The Last Supper, in which I've moved the rubble to the center of the gallery, and these chairs around have been draped in white. They were Naz's dining room chairs, but they symbolized the families who'd had to move away. And there was also a tape that played at the same time. And the tape was the voices of people, of District 6 residents, talking about it and what their memories were. Some people were very angry. Some were laughing and telling stories about the wonderful days of old District 6. The wedding singers sang, and there were sounds, calls to the mosque, and also mingled with the sounds of the bulldozers. The security police came to see this, but no action was taken. Sometimes exhibitions or paintings would get banned. And this is Naz's house, Manley Villa, it was called, and that's Naz leaning on her gate. And if you look on the right, you can see the house next door to is being demolished. And that is Naz in her house, with people wrote on the walls. It's again that idea of graffiti, which spills over from the streets into the homes. It's a way of expressing yourself. You can write your feelings and people will read it. And this is the eviction notice that was served to Naz, actually on the day that she was serving Eid, preparing Eid lunch. There was a knock on the door. And when she opened it, there was an official there with this eviction notice, and she slammed the door in her face. And that's when she turned and wrote, "Welcome to the Last Supper," on her wall. So this is a series of photographs. It's called Last Supper at Manley Villa. And that's Naz again. And some of the photos that I've showed, you'll see the demolition in the second last photograph. And in the last photograph, which was taken in 2008, the others were taken in 1981, you just see the bare hill where there's actually nothing. There's still nothing. It was all knocked down for nothing. Rebuilding has taken a very long time, and the wonderful spirit of District 6 is really gone. In 1993, which was 12 years after that first Last Supper, I started going back and seeing if the rubble was still there, and I found that it had been broken up. The large pieces had gone, but there were still all these little fragments left. Little bits of building material, china. Just some things were charming, some things were just very ordinary. The plastic rice packet, a little somebody's plaster that had been bound around a wound. And I placed them in museum cases. I did it by street, so that I'd find that street and I'd check out what was on that street. So this represented, I think this one was Constitution Street. So then I'd cast them in these little resin blocks, cast resin blocks, and put them on the shelves as if they were fragments which represented a community which had gone. And I also made a larger installation. You can see in this one some of the things that I found: a little Barbie doll shoe, hair slide, a little plastic bottle. And I made an installation called The Last Supper Revisited, which is on at the National Museum of African Arts in Washington just for a few more days. It's been up for a couple of years, but it's coming down on April the 3rd. And you see the family, Naz's family, having the Eid meal for the last time in District 6.
So I wanted to ask you, again, going with those objects and the fact that you often use these objects that were used by other people, right? And so something that actually just came to mind looking at these installations again for maybe the third or fourth time, could you speak more about the tension between these objects being removed from this kind of decimated area, right? And then put in the white cube, in a gallery, in a museum. And if you could just speak a little bit about that as an artist, that you're transforming these objects, but they are still objects with a history attached to people, and very much, as you said here, like it's very important that they're attached to a place.
Yes. Well, I think if we even go back to this one here, I mean, people driving into Cape Town every day. I mean, as I said, District 6 was very central to the city. So you drive past to work every day and see these demolitions going on. And it became part of the landscape. But once I took them out of District 6 and put them in a gallery, it got an enormous amount of press publicity. People went to see it. It was on television. That's what art does. It takes objects out of the place that they were, and it makes you look at it in a different way. I think that's what art does, which is one of the primary functions of art in a way. It's to give you a new vision of things. In displacing them and putting them somewhere else, you have to look at it differently.
Right.
So if we whiz on past there, and we've come now, this is yet another work that I've made on the subject of District 6, and this one was on a show in London last year, a show called Testimony at the Goodman Gallery, and that's a map of the old District 6 with all the streets marked in. And what I have done, it's like those windows of the houses are exploding all over the district, and these are the windows, and I've engraved into the glass with an engraving needle, and I've made drawings based on the old photographs of District 6, which was actually, they had very many beautiful old Victorian buildings. It's really terrible that it was demolished. But the thing is that the engravings are very delicate in there and just make the glass go white, but the engravings fall on the wall behind them so that the shadow looks like the drawing, but of course the shadow is totally ephemeral. And it's also, I used some of the old street signs, the Lurties Fisheries, fishing from the fish market, and the Decca Records music was a very big part of District 6. And you can see how crowded the district was from the top one. And this is another, moving on now to talking a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what that meant in South Africa. And I don't know if people know, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a commission that was brought into effect once the first democratic government was elected in 1994. And Nelson Mandela and all of his fellow parliamentarians decided that the only way to really deal or try to deal with the terrible trauma and the terrible violence of apartheid would be to invite people all around the country to come to and present their cases in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this commission was a group of very highly respected people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Pumla Gobodo Madikizela and other people of great standing. And they traveled around through schools and churches and listened to thousands of stories of people who came with their stories, trying to find out what happened to my father, where did my husband's body go? And the deal was that if you came in front of the commission as the person who was defending yourself, like for instance, this one is a policeman called Sneeman, who was responsible for the death of Nomonde Kalates on the left, and her husband had been killed and his body was burnt. And that is what Sneeman is answering to. But if you told the truth, and it didn't matter whether you were on the right or the left, if you told the truth and you showed that you'd acted from political conviction, you could apply for amnesty, because otherwise the truth would never have been told. I mean, all the files had been burnt and destroyed, or many of them had, immediately after the democratic election. And so that the evidence had been destroyed. So if there hadn't been this system, this promise of amnesty, people wouldn't have come forward. And my work was took phrases from the press, directly from all these images are directly from the press, and all these are texts. So I was trying to present the best case for both sides. So Nomonde was saying they burnt him. He was everything to me. And Sneeman replying he'd been prepared to lie. And he says, you can't really read it there, but it says he was a committed Christian. So you have these strange conversations that went on as we tried to get to the bottom of the story. I don't know if you would like to say something about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions.
Well, I will say something about, I think this work is really relevant, and also how right now, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has become a model, for better or for worse, because there are some criticisms of it, on how restorative justice can happen, right? And I'd also like to call it reparative justice, that this was one of the first large scale, I guess we could talk about the tribunals after the Holocaust, but in this part of our era, of the modern era, that this type of process was experimented with and attempted. And you have this work as well as some work you're going to show about videos, but I'd love for you to talk about the interactive quality of these, that I think also reflects the nature or the goal, some of the goals of the commission, that was about participation, right? And actually people taking responsibility and having a conversation about these incredibly horrific events that had happened over a very long period of time. And so how is the interactive quality of these works, and then you're going to go on and show some of the videos, part of that representation that you're giving us here?
Yes, my idea with all of them, is to, because so many white people said afterwards, oh, we didn't know all that was going on. If we knew, we would have done something, which is, to me, rubbish, because the information was there for anybody who wanted it. But what I decided with this was that these slats cover up a third of the images. If you want to look at the images underneath, if you want to uncover the faces, you have to physically move the slats around, so that there's actually a little finger hole. Can you see there's a little cutout on each slat, so you can actually move them. And I have seen groups of students going around, standing in front of each one, doing this process of trying to see the entire image.
Can you show the next one too?
I think, well, we're going to move on to oh yes, well, there you go. So you can see there.
The holes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this text reads, regard myself as a disgrace. Somebody was defending it. Revelations of relief and a burden, which was a thing which came up so often. You learned the truth, but it was a very, very painful and bitter truth. Mm-hmm. And he is saying, I wish to be reconciled. So with some of these, there is a reckoning. People accepted what had happened. And in other cases, they did not. They said they could never forgive. So It had a mixed reaction.
And I think that's also something that's very relevant today in terms of these types of processes of what, sometimes there's this idea that just forgiveness is the goal, right?
Yes.
But then not everyone can forgive. And of course, the forgiveness is on the victim's part, right? The victim's family. So it continues in some way, the imbalance of power and also of suffering that these types of commissions are trying to level out in some way. So I'd love for you to go on to the next one and also talk about the title of the video installation after this that you did about generations. So another thing that you're dealing with that the commission also dealt with was generational trauma. What happens, what about all those children whose parents and relatives were victims and were never around for them because they were killed?
Yes, so this is one of a series of videos which I made called No More Fairy Tales, in which I was attempting to look at the long-term effects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These works were made in 2017, is it? Anyway, 20 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was part of a larger project run by Madikizela Gaboda, which was looking at this whole thing of how trauma is passed down through generations. And these two young people, Sia Mgaduka on the left, the young man, and Candice Mama, are in discussion about what it was like to grow up without a father. Because in each case, both of their fathers had been killed by the apartheid police, but specifically a man called Eugene de Kock when they were very small. Candice was a toddler and Sia was about 18 months. And they actually hadn't met before we made this film, but I talked to both of them separately and they were prepared to discuss what it was like. And the film is called It's a Pleasure to Meet You. We're going to put a link up that you can access yourself because each of these films is 30 minutes. So there wasn't enough time to show them now. I think we need to move the screen, actually. It's kind of reflecting. And they also discuss the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because Sia actually went to it with his mother when he was about 6 or 8 at the time. And one of the policemen gave him the finger and put his tongue out at him, if you can believe that, this little boy, during a tea break. And it hardened his heart in such a way. He said he felt hate and bitterness and he can't forgive. Whereas Candice has decided that she is not going to let this burden her life. She has to move on. And she's just, she said it took her a very long time, but she went to visit her father's killer in jail and actually hugged him. And then couldn't believe that she'd actually hugged him. And when Sia hears this, he can't believe it either. He looks at her and he can't imagine how she could have done that. So I think you'd find it interesting to watch it.
Yes.
And
for the next one.
Yes, and during the conversation, Sia mentions that he hasn't talked to his mother. He hasn't mentioned his father's name to his mother for 15 years. And so I thought that it would be interesting for him to actually have that conversation with his mother on camera. And she agreed. And this was made 3 years after that. And first question that he asks is there anything about me that reminds you of my father? And you know that it's a question he's been wanting to ask all his life. And they talk about his father and how they met and how she learned about the death of his father. And he talks about how strange it was to live in a house where his mother went to bed every night in the largest room of the house, but she was always alone. He talks in a very intimate way about that. Mm-hmm. And they talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its failures. So this piece is called That Particular Morning being the morning that she learned of her husband's death. And you can find the link for that too. And I think we're going to move on now. And I'm just going to talk about some very different work.
Yeah, I just wanted to, introduce this work a little bit with a question about, I think what we've seen here in the last 37 minutes is that you are clearly a storyteller and an archivist. And I just wanted to ask you about who has been the audience. You've said that some of these audiences you presented to us were audiences for your art in the messages of protest and remembering. And how has it been received in different countries and at different times? And that's why we're kind of moving on to your more recent work that has moved out of South Africa, where you have been doing some interactive and community-based work. And I'd love for you to speak about your motivations to work in this way that looks a little bit different from what we just saw of the work that you were doing in South Africa, and how has this type of working with communities directly in making objects, how has it evolved, this type of work you're doing?
Well, while so much of my work has been involved in working in a society which is very unequal and very traumatized, South Africa, every single country has its problems. And in my work, I do travel around quite a lot. And I've become very interested in how it is for other countries. And it's a project that started in Cuba. And what I became interested in is trying to find what the message of each place was. And in Cuba in 2009, I found that people were very reluctant to talk to me. So the very first one I did was, you can just see a little bit of it there. El bloqueo está también en la mente. The blockade is also in the mind, was what one Cuban artist explained the problem. You censor yourself, you don't want to talk. The blockade is also in the mind. And that gave me the idea of making the text in letters like this and holding them up, as we used to hold up banners in protest. And so it's a project that I started. I then became interested in thinking about how it would be in other places. And I ran a workshop in the National Gallery in Harare in Zimbabwe in that same year. I think it was 2009. And this was a group of young artists and photographers, and we did some workshopping. And I asked them, what is it? What would you like to say to the world if you had a message? What is the situation in Zimbabwe now? And I asked people, it's a process in which people talk and we write things on many sheets of paper, and then we gradually narrow it down to the statement that the group feels most important. And finally, there's a voting system, and one statement wins. And then we make the letters up just in cardboard and paint it, and then find a place to photograph it. And I wanted to do it in Harare, but they said, no, we couldn't. We had to, we'd get into trouble with the police. So eventually we got a bus, and these are on some rocks outside Harare, and it reads Zuva Rabudarepi, and that's Shona. And it's an expression which means, for whom has the sun risen? Or in other words, who has all the power? It's a questioning of power. This one I did in Italy. I do only one in each city in a country. And this one is Naples. I try to find the cities in which there's some kind of tension. And the group in Naples told me that the problem with Naples is it's run by the gangs, the Camorra. You have to be very careful. In fact, one of the places that we considered doing the work of making this image was outside a cafe. The cafe was blown up one night, and they said it's a mistake to ask for advice. You have to be very careful who you trust. Otherwise, you can get dragged into the Camorra. Half of the businesses are owned by the Camorra. Mm-hmm. And then this is the last one I'm going to show. This one I've made in 2011. This is Krakow in Poland. And it's a town where the main tourist activity is taking buses to see the concentration camps from the Second World War. And the young people there talked to me about the burden of this history, which kind of hung over them like a cloud. Mm-hmm. And they came up with this line, youth facing history. And we decided that we should photograph it against a wall which was built by the Nazis to contain the Jewish ghetto in 1941. And there are just fragments of this wall left, but we photographed it there. So we have youth facing history. And history is a spiral. If we don't learn about our own history and consider it and think about what we can do to prevent it happening again, it will happen again. And I think this is quite an appropriate one to finish on, thinking about what that same the youth of Poland is now facing with Ukraine. And I'd like to just express solidarity with Ukraine.
Well, thank you for that. And I love that we are ending on this, because it's really relevant to some of the questions we have as well. And that this generational trauma and how so many communities of young people, I have some teenagers in my life as well. And this tension, right, between we want to move on, but we always also saying, but you need to know your history, right? And yes. How do you walk that line between making sure that the past is not forgotten, but also allowing the next generations to move forward and to not be mired in that trauma, right? And I think that there's no answer to that fully, right? But I love that this work is directly addressing that issue for young people that are, all of us are living in places that are steeped in histories that are not great, that are traumatizing, and that we should never completely forget. So that actually leads, we have 4 questions in the Q&A that I'd like to move to here. And I'm going to jump around a little bit because the third question that came in was, what advice do you have for young artists beginning their careers? And I think that this is relevant to this youth and generational trauma question, right? So how do young artists move on, and how do they also figure out what kind of topics to address? So can we start with that one, and then I'll jump up to some of the other ones that were asked.
Well, I'm assuming that the question relates specifically to artists who would perhaps like to work in their own communities. Well, I think my general advice to young artists is, what is it that really you find most interesting? What is the most interesting thing to you in your life? That is what you must be addressing. And because it's your voice, everyone has got a unique voice, and it's what interests you most that you should be working on. But if that is a community, something that's happening in your community that you'd like to address, I would just suggest going and finding out what's going on and who you can talk to, and seeing what you can do, and just listening and hanging around for a while and talking to people. And perhaps it's nothing to do with art at first, you do something else, but it will lead into things. You'll get a feeling for what's happening, and you can gradually perhaps see which, make a suggestion, see something that you'd like to do. But it's about really getting involved. You can't just rush in and expect to do something and rush out again. It's about involvement.
Right. So this is somewhat related. The very first question we had was, what is your studio practice like? Do you ever come back to pieces again after a period of time and rework them? Do you work with assistants? So more about what it's like being an artist.
I have a studio. You can see it right behind me. I'm sitting in it now. I'm here every day of the week. And during lockdown, I started drawing at home as well on my kitchen table when I wasn't allowed to come to the studio. I do have an assistant who's been helping with the lighting and so on, Megan. And I also do sometimes call in other people. I have things fabricated if I need it. I do return to things quite often. As I've showed, I do like going back to things, as a matter of fact, because I'm always interested in what's happening now, what is the moment? And I try to pinpoint that moment. For instance, at the TRC, the Truth Games works that I was talking about, that was all done from the press from that time. And I couldn't remake those works now because that was then, but then I can do it in another way. I can look and see, well, what was the long-term effect of that? Go back to the young people and ask them, how are you feeling about that? And what is your reaction now? So I try to pinpoint specific moments, but yes, I do return to certain themes and work them in many different ways.
Okay, the next question is, the Last Supper Manley Villa that you showed earlier is an interesting piece. I am curious about the last photo of the hill. What is the significance of that last image being in color among all of the black and white images before that?
The reason I put it in color was to show the time that had passed. The others were all in black and white and taken in 1981. That one was taken in 2008. It was really to show time passing. The color is somewhat reduced so that it's rather a pale color, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew that it was later. It's like moving from black and white to color. So just to show passing time.
And that also relates to that previous question about revisiting, right?
Yes.
In terms of you going back there just to see the site itself many, many years later.
Yes.
So one of our last questions is, what's next for you? What future projects would you like to see realized?
Well, lockdown, we're still sort of in the effects of lockdown. I would like to continue talking to people, making more video works in that series, in which there are interactions between people discussing things. But I've also actually been working on a new series of drawings, which I haven't shown now, in which I've been looking at old postcards from colonial Africa and redrawing them. And on a series called Postcards from Africa, which is in which I've been redrawing the landscapes, but not drawing in the people who were originally photographed. So that, for instance, you may see a line of women who've been collecting water, because I didn't want to reproduce the colonial eye, so that you'll see the landscape, you'll see a line of pots as if they're hanging in the air, but you don't see the women who actually had the pots on their heads. So I've been making those drawings, and I've also been, I possibly will do something more around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because there are some of those cases which have just come up again recently. They're coming back to the courts, and I might do something around those again. So those are some of the things I'm looking at.
I love how you mentioned in your description of this future project, one you're working on, that you don't want to reproduce the colonial eye. And so that also, I think, relates to some of the use of the objects, this going back and forth between the decision-making you have to do as an artist, and especially as a white artist depicting Black people, when is it appropriate for you to represent the body, and when is it more effective and appropriate to have objects to stand in as those bodies. And I feel that in some of these works, the idea of labor is something that's really important here, what these Black bodies are actually doing. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit more about that in terms of a consideration that you have often in your work about not reproducing the colonial eye.
Well, I think that, yes, I've tried to, I started as a journalist. That's what I was going to be first of all, and a writer. And so I think that I work from the point of view of a documentarian most of the time. I think when we're talking about not reproducing the colonial eye, if you think of a postcard of the portraits that I did of women, it was very important to me that the image was one that was a portrait of them, representing them as a very important person, not just a person in costume whose name you don't even know, who's sitting there for the camera, but a very strong woman who's got a history. And so I suppose that's one aspect. Yeah, and then the series of postcards, as I say, it's quite strange, actually. They're quite ghostly. They're sort of boats without people in them. And there's people sifting corn, but you don't see the people. It's as if I'm just trying to be very respectful to those people who were once photographed, probably unwillingly made to stand for the camera performing some act. But you just see the action around it, but not the people themselves, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. So another question has come in. I'm trying to get to as many as I can. One of them here is which I think is relevant to what you're talking about. South African art is often canonized with the art of the 1980s and 90s, largely political and based on an interaction with international audiences, such as Kendricks, Rose, and Gears. Is there another way to discuss South Africa that predates, or I should say South African art, that predates this moment? Is there a South African art canon?
Well, we do have some artists in fact, there's quite an interesting exhibition on the Norval Museum at the moment, which is Black women artists from when was it? I think it's from 1900 to the present. There are artists like Gladys Magudlulu, who's a really amazing, there are artists. It's probably just not that well known outside South Africa. But she was one of them, and Nurai Mabasa. There is a canon that is outside that framework.
Right. Let me see, I think we're coming to the end here. This is sort of related. There's a very general question here. What other artists do you admire, living or dead, whose work have had an impact on your own artistic practice?
I think there are many artists whose work I admire, and for different reasons. I mean, I'm thinking, and they may be entirely, Bridget Riley, who's showing at the moment at the Yale Center at the British Art. I'm looking forward to seeing that show. And it's almost, I was a great fan of people like Bruce Nauman. I mean, it's so wide, really, the artists that I admire. Gillian Waring, who I think is showing at the Guggenheim at the moment. But I suppose an early influence for me was Robert Rauschenberg. I mean, I didn't start as an artist, and I was living in New York in the 60s, and he was the way that he dealt with political imagery and silk screening and so on was really very, very inspiring for me. But there have been other artists. I'm afraid I can't even think of them offhand, but I mean, a lot of artists whose work I have admired. Rachel Whiteread, whose work I was watching the other day on your series, who actually I met her in Sydney when we were on the Biennale together. I like the way that she deals with spaces and.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end here. And we didn't get to all the questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to them all. But I just wanted to, as you see in the chat, to remind people of upcoming programs. But first, I would like to thank Sue for joining me and joining all of us. We had a great turnout here on the Zoom. And it was just a thrill for me, someone who, as I mentioned in the very beginning, would have known absolutely nothing about South African art, and nor would my students if it hadn't been for you and your initiative to make sure to document, as you said, with your journalist background, so much of the work that was happening in the streets, in the galleries at this pivotal time in the history of South Africa. And I really feel that your book and also your work really inspired so many artists, activists throughout the world. And none of us would have known anything about it if it hadn't been for you. So thank you, Sue, for joining me today. And I just want to say the next program is Monday, March 28th at 12 p.m. with artist Tracy Emin in conversation with Martina Droth, the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of YCBA. So you'll see the registration link in the chat. And again, this has been a real honor for me, Sue, to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, I would like to just say thank you from my side. I'm extremely honored to be on this series. I've really enjoyed the previous conversations, and I'm sure I'm going to enjoy the others as well. And it's an honor for me to talk to you, Kymberly. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.